Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, it's a minute early, but well, my clock says it's 5 seconds early, so. All right, we're beginning in John chapter 19 this morning. John 19. He's already been tried by the Sanhedrin, so-called tried. We discussed how it wasn't a trial at all. He's been presented before Pilate and was tried before Pilate. Pilate didn't announce he didn't find anything wrong with this man. He ought to be let free, and they wouldn't have it. And so he said, "Okay, I'll release for you." It's a custom that we'll release one of somebody in the hold, and so I'll give you a choice. Not just you can either have Barabbas, who is an insurrectionist, he's an evil man, or you can have Christ, who has done nothing. Which do you choose? So that's no brainer, right? Well, they still wouldn't have it. They'd rather have it of a man that's, they were willing to have Jesus put to death for the security of their nation. They were. And yet, why would they have one released who would threaten their security as a nation instead of this one? Okay. And so that's what they're demanding. And so Pilate, in spite of the fact he said he's an innocent man, that is, they still wouldn't have it. So finally, he as it was written in another passage, that he washed his hands symbolically, says, "I'm not going to have anything to do with it. His blood is on your hands." And it's interesting to note that the Jews, as they were demanding Jesus to be crucified, that they said, "Let his blood be upon not only our heads, but also the heads of our children." Okay. So they were taking the blood of this innocent man upon their heads. And you recall from Matthew 25 or 24, when Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he was talking about that judgment is going to come upon. And in chapter 23, he says, "Let the fullness." Let me see, Matthew 23. Verse 34 says, "Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them ye shall scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar." And so he was making the point that, yes, judgment was going. Look, verse 36, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come into this generation." It's going to happen to you guys. Okay. Verse 37, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them with our sin unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chicken under her wings, and ye would not." Jesus, in spite of the fact that Jerusalem was guilty of killing so many of God's prophets and shedding innocent blood, and still continuing on with Christ, and he said, "How often I would have gathered you in, nevertheless, but you would not." And he makes a pronouncement, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate," or empty. And so judgment was going to come upon Jerusalem, and here they were demanding that the innocent blood of Christ be shed. They were demanding that Christ be crucified, and that they were going to accept the blood on their heads and their children. And guess what? It came to pass in AD 70 that they suffered the judgment upon that city that came from Christ, because of not only for the innocent blood of Christ, but the innocent blood of all the prophets, all those that were shed in Jerusalem. So as we continue in chapter 19, or if you start in 19, "Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him." That's a pretty simple statement. They scourged him. What does that mean? What happened when the Romans would scourge someone? What was that punishment? Is everyone familiar with how they would? You've probably heard this before, but I think as we were singing the song before the Lord's Supper this morning, I was thinking about the price that Christ paid, the suffering he went through. and as it was in the Roman system of scourging, they would have not a barrel, but they have something like a barrel, and they'd lay him over the tabletop, and so it would basically stretch out his back, the skin on his back, and all this stuff. And the tool they would use was a cat. They call it cat o' nine tails. It was a whip that had out of the single stem came 9 different stems that were woven with leather, and on the end of each of these, it was very flexible, and on each of these would either be broken glass and jagged rocks and things like that, or it would be just lead balls, both of which would be do tremendous damage to the individual to whom they were scourging. And as this skin was laid, stretched over this barrel, not a barrel, but this tabletop, whatever, and they would begin to beat him with this, and it's thought that probably Jesus was beaten with the lead balls. You think, well, it's a blunt object, big deal. You think, well, what's he going to get? Just bruises? Well, no, it starts to actually break the skin apart because the skin is stretched apart. And as the beating continues, it just lays open all the flesh. And it was very severe. In fact, most men died from just the scourging. Okay, so and it would bear him open that sometimes they would even bear to where they could see the back of his lungs. Okay, that's how severe it was. And so, and as they took him, in verse 2 he says, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put him on the purple robe. So after he had scourged him, now they're going to have sport with him. They have fun, as it were. They probably don't understand what they were doing, but they're mocking him basically. And so they played like King of the Jews, So they plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Now, when you talk about thorns, it's not like rosebush thorns. In that area, the thorns were like so long, maybe 3 or 4, 5 inches long, and when they would they would pierce. So as they would put this plait of thorns upon his head, the long thorns would dig into the head, and the scalp, the skin is very the scalp is very thin. And as it punctured the head, of course, you have so many capillaries and veins in the head and the scalp that it would just puncture and you just bleed profusely. And here they are just ramming that down on his head. They put on this purple robe as though, purple is the royal color. And so as though they were making fun, as though he were a king. Of course, he is a king. And said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him with their hands. And this doesn't reveal everything that they did. Look at Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27. Okay, in verse 29. And when they had plaited the crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and reed it in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. Now this isn't one thing. This is in the imperfect tense. That is, it was an activity that wasn't completed one time. They kept on doing it over and over again. It was something they continued to mock him. They continued to spit upon him and smote him with that reed upon the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him, put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. And so as they had their fun smacking him, you can imagine these soldiers, the kind of treatment they'd give him, think about the kind of... Palestine had always been problematic to the Roman Empire. They were always wanting to put off the chains of the Roman rule over them, and there was insurrections. Barabbas was one of the insurrectionists. Simon was one of the apostles. Was Simon the Zealot? The Zealot was not his name; it was what he was doing. He was one of those who was involved with trying to put off the Roman government. The reason why the Roman army came and encircled and laid siege to Jerusalem was because they had rebelled. And for a while they successfully rebelled. They had actually driven the Roman army out But of course, the empire being as large as it was, the resources it had, it sent in a general that was well experienced in this kind of warfare, and they just cleaned out all of Judea, went from city to city to city, and just until finally ended up in Jerusalem. But the reason was because of their rebellion against the Roman Empire, and this was going on and on. And so, as you think about these Roman soldiers who were sent down as their job, they were I'm thinking about what's the term they use when our own GIs and they get their orders to go somewhere. They're deployed, yeah, and this wasn't necessarily a place they really wanted to go. With the kind of the attitude was, these guys are people, they're problematic, they're making me come down here like this, and so it was. What kind of an attitude would they have against Jesus being that King of the Jews and all that? So they were just having their fun, as it were, mocking him and all this. Look at look at verse 22 of Matthew 27. Actually, 21. The governor answered and said unto them, whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, let him be crucified. And the governor said, why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified. Now, this is not a casual conversation. This is not a controlled, calm. You can imagine this is a mob scene where everybody's demanding that Christ be killed, and Pilate's trying to say, look, he's not guilty. What do you want me to do? And so they're all gathered around. He's on the platform saying, he's not guilty, and what do you want me to do? Shall I release Barabbas? And so as they're crying out, crucify him, and the governor said, why? What evil has he done? It's not like, oh, why? It's like, this is a mob scene, but they cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, his blood be on us and on our children. That's where they were saying, yeah, his blood be on us. I don't know what they understood what they were saying. And the consequences and the seriousness of what they were saying, they didn't take Jesus seriously for who he was. Okay, so back in John 19. And so they had been hitting him, spitting at him, making fun of him, Hail, King of the Jews, and then all this. In verse 4 of chapter 19, Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto him, behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. So here he had him scourged. The soldiers had just abused him like that. And he says, I bring you now. I didn't find anything wrong with him. And yet he still beat him. Perhaps he was trying to appease the mob so that he would spare Jesus' life. But nevertheless, and chances are very good that the beating was so severe, he was pretty well his facial features were pretty well distorted. Okay, it was hard to recognize him. Verse 5, then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto him, behold the man. Okay, look at him. And take a look at what he is. Take a look at what the beating he's taken. He's not gone without punishment. Okay. Verse 6, when the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify. When you look at the King James Version, possibly the American Standard, it says crucify him. Him is in italics. Him is assumed. It's like when you could give a command, you is assumed. Second person is assumed. And so like here is like crucify him. It's assumed that I mean crucify. So as you think about crucify, crucify. And so it was almost like a chant. And as they're calling out for the death of Jesus, crucify, crucify. Pilate saith unto them, take ye him and crucify, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. So now they're calling upon their law. And of course, there he is. He made himself to be the Son of God. Pilate asks, who are you? Who are you? And then when the Jews say he made himself to be the Son of God, in verse 8, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. It was his wife who came by and said, have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I've suffered many things this night because of him. She had dreams about his innocence. Okay, and she was warning Pilate, her husband, don't have anything to do with him. And so now he's saying, now he's afraid. Who is he? Who is he? And went again into the judgment hall and saith unto Jesus, whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Where do you come from? Who are you? Then saith Pilate unto him, speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? So I have the power of life and death to you, Jesus. Why are you not answering me? And Jesus answered, thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. So Jesus is letting Pilate know he is doing this because it's been given him the power to do that. The only reason that Jesus was allowed to be here was because God had allowed this to happen. And as you think about the order of hierarchy, the order of authority, of course, God having all authority, Christ giving all authority today, all governments are under him. And civil governments are authorized and ordained by God that civil governments would rule righteously. That's the purpose. So to punish the evildoer and to reward the good doer. Okay. And whereas Pilate was one of those involved with civil governments, and that was their purpose, and so it reinforces that God is the all authoritative figure, and that the only authority that civil governments have, that's what's been given to them. And we think about the role of our governments on earth. It's to serve God's purpose, and that's to punish the evildoer and reward the good doer, protect civilization, mankind, from those that would do evil. So that when you think about the civil governments don't have the right to do whatever they want to do. They don't have the right nor the authority to just rule by fiat, to rule by whatever their desire is. Rather, they have a responsibility to God. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was given to him by God, and he was to rule for the purpose of serving God's purpose, of course. Okay. So as God has the power to bring nations up and to bring nations down, so that we need to understand that our own legislators need to understand their authority doesn't come from themselves. We talk about our own documents of we the people, that the right to be of the government comes from the will of the people. And so it's by the consent of the people that government takes its authority. And well, it still comes to the authority of God fulfilling his purpose. And so as Jesus made the point, you couldn't have done this except it were given from above. And he goes on to say, therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Who's that? The Jews. So when they said, let his blood be upon us, our heads, and the heads of our children, it really would be. I'm not so sure about their children, but they would hold the responsibility. But in that generation, they did suffer the consequences of all the righteous blood having been shed upon all the earth. In verse 12, and thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. So they're applying this political pressure upon Pilate. Say, look, you need to do this, because if you don't, you're going to pay for it, because you're going to look like a traitor to Caesar. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And so they're using that as Jesus, King of the Jews, as one of the insurrectionists. 13, when Pilate therefore heard them saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. Once again, the same. So now he's about to pronounce a judgment. He's sitting down there, making an official judgment. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto him, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. How convenient. This little ruse was playing into their favor. This is very useful to make us look loyal to Caesar. They weren't. They were concerned about the welfare of their nation, keeping everything that they had, and so they were using this as a way and getting at Pilate so that they would kill Jesus, because that was their purpose. We had read back in the previous chapters that they had determined that they would seek out a way to kill Jesus. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and 2 other with him on either side, one and Jesus in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title then read many of the Jews. For the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So Pilate was going to make sure that everybody that was there could read it, could understand it, and what was said. And I wonder if Pilate had done this to spite the Jews, knowing that Jesus was an innocent man, that for envy that they had delivered them to him, and they were not about to do justice, even though Pilate sought all sorts of ways out to free Jesus. They would have none of it. And so he puts on that sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, for all to read, whether it be Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Latin, the official language of the Roman government. Then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, Write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. So that was, they were trying to get that distinction. But Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. And so he wasn't going to change that. That's very interesting that we'll see there when Jesus dies, the centurion that was there said, Surely this was the Son of God. A Gentile who'd said that. And here we have Pilate, a Gentile, who's putting on the cross the King of the Jews. Okay, and all these things, these testimonies from non-Jews. And so it's like condemning the nation for rejecting Jesus as the Christ. I mean, it's in their face, and they're rejecting it. I mean, it's before them. You think about you ever make a terrible mistake? You do something, and later it has, what you've done has led you down a path where there are dire consequences, and just you wish you had never done it. Think about, what if I had just done one thing different? Just one thing. And the whole chain of events wouldn't have gone there. And so, if you just done one thing. And so you had all the signs in front of you. Don't go this way, turn away, turn that way, stop. But you weren't paying attention to it. And before you know it, after all had transpired, you realize the error. Well, here it was, the right in their face, King of the Jews, right in their face, behold the man, behold your king. And they were rejecting all that. They were not following the signs, and the end result, of course, is Christ crucified on the cross, and they were guilty of it. As Jesus had said, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Okay. Verse 23. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. They said therefore among themselves, Let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, They parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture did they cast lots. These things, therefore, the soldiers did. So just as was prophesied in the Old Testament, we'll look at some Old Testament prophecies in a moment, that they were being fulfilled one after the other. And remember, the purpose of John's writing this epistle was to prove that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, and that we would believe that, and in believing, we'd have everlasting life. That's the purpose. And so John is pointing out that this thing happened and it fulfilled Old Testament prophecy, further proof that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, this is something that Jesus, some people, there are a lot of critics of Jesus, have been for the centuries past, that Jesus was a guy that happened to grow up in Galilee, happened to be born in Bethlehem, all these things that happened to him, and he used these things in his life and then tailored his life to model that of the prophecies of the Christ from the Old Testament. And so what he did was use these things, the Old Testament, to guide his life so that he could do these things and prove that he was the Son of God. The problem is there's some things he had no control over. Like he had no control over where he was born. He had no control where his parents took him to grow up. He had no control over the guards, the soldiers, what they would do with his garments. This is one of those things that he had no control. This was prophesied hundreds of years before this event. And the soldiers all did these things to fulfill the prophecy, and Jesus didn't have anything to do with that. So the critics who criticize Jesus for these things, that he made himself out to be the Son of God by using the Old Testament scriptures, it doesn't hold water. The arguments just don't hold water. Okay. Jesus, you think about the love of Christ, how, in spite of all these things that are going on, if you were being crucified on the cross, being falsely accused, and being basically murdered on the cross, what would you be thinking? What would be foremost on your mind? Look what was foremost on the mind of Christ, even while he was dying on the cross. Verse 26, 25. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Now this disciple whom he loved, we learn really is John, the disciple John, the author of this, the writer of this gospel account. And so as it was standard practice in those days, as he would refer to himself not in the first person, but as that one, that man, the disciple. And so he says, Woman, behold thy son. What's he talking about? Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her into his own home. What is he talking about here?
He took care of her.
He took care of her. In what way? I said, yeah, you're right. He took care of her because she, being apparently a widow, no longer having a son to take care of her, now has no way to take care of her. And so he's charging John to take care of my mother. And so he says, Behold your son, Mom. And John, behold your mother. He's giving John the charge to take care of his mother as he's thinking about not just himself, but all those around him. In spite of all things that are going around, it's just amazing that Jesus had the presence of mind, that Jesus was still, he wasn't focusing on himself so much. He was looking at what was going on and what needed to be dealt with.
Also, Jesus was the eldest of the siblings, and I do believe it was the manner of the Jews that the eldest should take care of their parents. And Joseph, in fact, had died. It would be to Jesus to take care of his mother.
Okay. To whom? Yeah. Would it fall upon another one of his brothers? I don't know. But he gave John the charge. There was a relationship between John and Jesus that looked like close friendship. It was like brother and brother kind of friendship. So after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, saith, I thirst. That was prophesied from the Old Testament too. Now there was set a vessel full of vinegar, and they filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth. Now that's the part that's actually prophesied. The fact that he said, "I thirst," was not, but the fact that they took this vinegar or sour wine, they put it up to his mouth to put. But in verse 30, but when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. The last prophecy had been fulfilled. Now there are like 7 different statements that's recorded for us in the 4 gospel accounts. These were a couple of them for us to read about. And so as all things had been accomplished, all the prophecies had been fulfilled, and he's fulfilling his purpose, he said, "It's finished." And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Okay. At this point, I want to consider some Old Testament scriptures to think about. Isaiah 50, verse 6. Let's go to Isaiah right now. We'll spend a little time prophecies of Isaiah. It says, "I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting." Well, that's pretty well what happened. Look at chapter 53. This is more involved with the kind of things that Christ suffered. When you think about, the Ethiopian eunuch was reading the scrolls of Isaiah, and it looked like he was reading this passage in chapter 53, beginning of verse 7, basically. But we'll look at verse 1. And I often thought, what's the deal with verse 1? What's it all about? "Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed?" I think, what is this all about? Was he lamenting the fact that his own kinsmen at the day, the contemporaries of his day, were rejecting what he was saying, what he was reporting that God had told him to write? He said, "Who hath believed our report?" Who's believing Isaiah? And Isaiah did prophesy against them that they were going to suffer because of the basically he was predicting that the Assyrians would come in and invade, like they would in like they had in Judah. I'm sorry, not Judah, but Israel. But so he says, "Who's been reported?" But I'm thinking, Jesus was not the guy that everybody thought they expected to be. They were looking for a king. They were looking for a king like David or Solomon, some powerful ruler that would restore the kingdom they had under those days back to what it was. And that's the king they were looking for. Jesus was nothing like that, and they didn't like that. He was one that was bringing them what mankind needed: forgiveness of sins, salvation from everlasting torment. And so he was dealing with what we really need. But they were just still stuck in the physical, we want our kingdom. And his disciples were even looking for that too. But so as Jesus came to the scene, so Isaiah is saying, "Who hath believed our report?" I think that was a prophecy about how Jesus would be received. So he says, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground." When Nebuchadnezzar came down to Judah and destroyed it, he destroyed their line of kings. He destroyed the throne. The throne was removed from out of Jerusalem, never to be ruled again on the earth. You remember that Zechariah, I think his name was, the king at the time, was it Zechariah or was it Joiah? One of the kings that was reigning at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. He had all of his sons killed before him. All of his sons were killed before his very eyes. And then he was blinded. So that's the last thing he saw, were all his sons being killed. Okay. So the line had dried up. But there was a root out of Jesse. Jesse also falling in the bloodline of the kingship. And so, but it looked like the bloodline was all dried up. There's no more kings ruling on earth after that point. And so Jesus coming out of the dry ground, the tender plant coming out of dry ground, he was that tender root. Came out of the branch of Jesse. Okay. He hath no former comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He's going to be a normal looking guy. He's not going to be a fantastic specimen of a man like Saul was. Rather, he was just a normal looking guy. Verse 3, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we had hid it as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Nobody appreciated him for who he was, except for a few. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Sort of like Job's friends. When they came by to console him, they saw what had happened, like they didn't recognize him really. But they said, "What did you do wrong?" So they were scorning him. They esteemed him not. They despised him because they were saying, "What did you do wrong?" Because nobody suffers like this unless he's really sinned. Well, that's how Christ was esteemed. Of course, we know he was sinless. He's the only one that lives sinlessly upon the face of the earth. And so we did esteem him stricken and smitten of God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. So that Christ paying the price for our sins, we can find healing because of what he endured for us. Verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Christ died for the world. Christ died for us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. You remember when Pilate was questioning him, Jesus wouldn't answer him. He's Pilate saying, "Why don't you answer me? Don't you know I can have you killed, or I can give you life?" And so as he remained quiet, as he went as a sheep to the slaughter, he went without resistance, without violence, just as when they would make their sacrifices. I wonder why they used a sheep for their animal sacrifices. Because it just stands there and takes it. He was taken from prison and from judgment. He didn't have any justice. We looked at that. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. So he was killed before it was his time. Untimely death. Verse 9. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. So just as he was crucified before two malefactors either side of him, but yet when he was buried in a tomb that had never been used before. He was counted among the rich. Okay, he was buried with the rich in his death. Look at verse 12. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul into death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. That's Jesus today. He's intercessing for us, transgressors. So, look at Psalm 22. You'll recognize this first verse. This whole psalm is just rich with prophecy. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me, and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in thee, they trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee, and were delivered. They trusted in thee, and were not confounded. But I am a worm, and no man, a reproach of men, and despised of the people. That's Christ, how Christ was treated. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. So like, if you be the Son of God, come down off that cross. Or those two malefactors side by side. If you're the king, if you're the Son of God, save us all. You know? And so as the psalm goes, all they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot the lip out and they shake their head, saying, he trusted in the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. Look at verse 12. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. So as you think about the Sanhedrin, as they were minded to put Christ to death, and it was all about accusing him whatever they could with. And so there were all these bulls were round about, making the accusations, bringing charges against him that were unfounded. Verse 16, for dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Think about the cross. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. So on the cross, going through that kind of agony, the pain is so severe and intense. And it's like you can tell. You ever say, I could feel every nerve in my body. Jesus could feel every nerve in his body. When they talk about, I didn't talk about the actual crucifixion, but they had the what we call railroad spikes. They used to be giant spikes to nail him to the cross. And they said they pierced his hands. Well, if they pierced what we consider the hand and the palm, the flesh would tear out and it wouldn't hold him up. So they had to pierce him on the wrist, which as they pierced his hands, this was all in a sub-assembly, as you might say. It was all integrated. Okay, so when they talk about the hands, they're talking about the whole into your hand. So as they would pierce him, this would be the best spot to hold the man right into his wrists. Okay, and you realize that one of our main nerves runs right through there. As that spike would cut through that thing, searing pain would cut through the body. And so as the kind of pain that would go through because of the damage to these nerve centers, both sides, he felt everything. Okay, and so as I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. So we can see the prophecy of the Old Testament about the crucifixion itself. The suffering went through. Now, as we look at like when John wrote that they scourged him, they don't really deal with all that involves. They just said he scourged him, and they crucified him. That's all he said. They done, and it's not the purpose. The purpose of the accounts was to prove that Jesus is the Christ. It wasn't to make us gag in agony, or just feel. But when we consider, as we think about the Lord's Supper, as we partake of it, and we think about the body that was crucified and the blood that was shed, we talk about the love of God having done this. He died. He was obedient even to death on the cross. And you talk about, and Jesus himself said if I can remember this. For a righteous man, some would dare to die. No. For a man would scarcely die for a righteous man. For a good man, some would even dare to die. But Christ died for all of us. I can't remember. I should remember that. But Christ died for us. He died for us even while we were yet sinners. He didn't die for good man. He didn't die for a righteous man. He died for us. And he suffered that much because he loved us so much. And as these gospel accounts, the purpose wasn't to make people squirm with empathizing with the agony. But I think about when we do contemplate the price that Christ paid, it helps us to understand the depth of God's love, Jesus' love, what he did for us. just dying for us. It wasn't like he stood up before the firing squad and then instantly was killed. He spent hours dying agonizingly. They made it painful. That was the purpose of crucifixion, was to make it painful, as uncomfortable as possible. And this is what Jesus did for us. And as we look at the various statements that were given, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And we told the thief on the cross, today you will be in paradise. And when he spoke to John and his mother, behold thy son, and to John, behold thy mother. And of course, Eli, I can't even remember that. My God, why hast thou forsaken me, basically. And he said, I thirst. And then when he said, it's finished. And then finally he said, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Interesting that Jesus has a spirit, just like we have a spirit. You know, when he was talking to the woman at the well, he said, God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And so as God is a spirit, he's created us in his image. We are spirits. And as we worship in spirit and in truth. And so it's interesting to think that Jesus, God, has a spirit, like we have a spirit. Okay, so to finish off, well, this is the last. We'll stop here. We'll pick up on. We'll pick up on verse 31 next time. Appreciate your attention, and I know I didn't allow for much dialogue, but I appreciate your comments, and we'll pick up next week.